here. Safia, do you want to start us off with any announcements or anything, or should I just jump right
in? Welcome everybody. I'm proud to be hosting this one especially. I'm going to be muting anybody when they come in, and all you have to do is unmute yourself when you want to speak. And if you can do me a favor, if your phone or computer happens to unmute, if you can make sure to mute yourself so that we can hear it as clear as possible. And with that, we can begin. In the text, we have, in the chat, Nati has already put in links, so you can find those links. And we are going to be recording this webinar. And with that, the webinar's name is Cursed is the Ground for Your Sake, which is an introduction to Jewish farming, and it's hosted by Nati Passow. And I want to read from his bio that for the past 14 years, Nati has run the Jewish Farm School, overseeing many different projects and programs. He's passionate about bringing ancient Jewish wisdom to bear on contemporary food and environmental justice issues. And Nati lives in West Philadelphia with his partner and 2 kids and an ever-changing array of housemates and guests. And on a personal level, this exact webinar I've actually seen in various forums, as Nati over many years has worked on this exact topic and refined this session. And it's the relationship of food and farming, sustainability, justice, and working around these issues and presenting it many times. And he's done a lot of work to really refine it. And just with that, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Safia. Again, it's really exciting to be here and share this material with folks. For folks who either weren't on the webinar we did a few weeks ago or maybe aren't aware, this webinar is part of a Jewish community farming field building initiative, which is a project of about 15 organizations working to advance the field of Jewish farm-based education. And we recently put out what we call the JCF Seed Packet, which is a rather large collection of curriculum and educational resources and practical information like budget templates and evaluation questions and things along those lines. All of that is available for free to anyone who wants to access it. I put a link in the chat for that as well, that you can find that off of the Jewish Farm School website. All of the material that I'm sharing today is found within the seed packet. We're also going to be looking over a couple different source sheets. So I put the links to a direct download for those. It would be helpful if you had those materials in front of you for our discussion today. And I've also put an invitation. We probably have too many people to do an opening circle where we would all share. But I wanted to invite folks in the chat box to share a little bit about themselves, and the prompt is share your name, where you are, that could be your location and or your organization, and one way that you have benefited from agriculture today. So some people are already adding to that, so feel free to jump into that in the sidebar. Yeah, well, a couple more kind of introductory notes before we get into it. And again, you're going to want to download those 2 source sheets. Yeah, please keep yourself muted if you're not actively talking to the group. So this is, as Safia mentioned, this is my kind of introduction to Jewish farming class that has been kind of ever evolving over the last 10 to 15 years, really meant to look at kind of some of the foundational texts in Jewish tradition, primarily from the Torah itself, about what Judaism says about agriculture. And is there kind of a blueprint that our tradition offers that could be relevant for us today as we think about participating in designing food systems that are just and equitable and sustainable. So this is normally a class that I would give over 2 or 3 sessions, each one anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half. And I've also done it in a much more truncated kind of version, like a 20-minute talk. This will be somewhere in between. I basically want to run through some of the main texts that I would use and give you a sense of kind of the progression that I follow, and give you the tools to then work with these texts in a deeper way and bring these to participants or students that you might be working with. So normally this would be kind of a discussion-based class. For the sake of time today, we won't be able to really have kind of the juicy discussion that these texts often engender, but we will close with some questions and answers. So hopefully there'll be some time for a little bit of discussion towards the end. And also you can feel free to post questions in the chat box. Psachia will be keeping an eye on that and kind of get my attention in case there's something that does come up. Or if you are on video, you can kind of wave and try to get my attention as well if there's something, you know, if you have a specific question at any point. And yeah, and then the last thing is at the end, I'm going to point you to 2 other kind of educational materials that relate to this content that again are available through the seed packet and you can access, and we would love for those to get used kind of far and wide. Okay, so as Psachia mentioned, for 14 years, I was running an organization called the Jewish Farm School, which we recently just closed. And the field of Jewish communal farming, community farming is much more robust now than it was 14 years ago. And so often kind of telling people what we were doing or trying to raise money for our project, there'd be a lot of kind of confused looks where people would say, what exactly does that mean, Jewish farming? And so that kind of prompted me to investigate this a little bit. And I thought, well, you know, where does agriculture first show up in the garden and in the Torah? And it's actually quite early on. It's in just the first couple of chapters of Bereshit, of Genesis. We have the creation story. And if you're able to pull up the source sheet, the first one that says, "Cursed is the ground for your sake," we'll be working with the texts that are on that source sheet for now. So early on in the story, God plants a garden and he places the humans in the garden. The Hebrew is le'ovda u'lishomra, to work it and to protect it, to serve it and to protect it. There's a lot of interesting translations of that phrase. But it's a model that's presented of kind of stewardship of the land. That humans, the Hebrew for human is Adam, and the Hebrew for earth is Adamah, showing this kind of intrinsic connection between humans and the land. That we're there to kind of tend the garden. It's if you have images of Eden, it's a paradise. It's a place where people are living a relaxed life, full of abundant food and kind of quiet peacefulness. And Arthur Waskow has a beautiful way, Rabbi Arthur Waskow of Philadelphia has a beautiful way of explaining this. God says to the humans, I am putting you in this garden and I am giving you so much abundance. There is so much abundance. All this food for you is good to eat. All I ask is that you show the tiniest bit of restraint. Please don't eat from this tree. The humans are in the garden for like 20 minutes when they eat from that tree. And what's interesting in the text is that the commandment to not eat from the tree, is we're told that if we eat from it, we will surely die. And we have this serpent who comes along and kind of convinces Eve, saying, no, you're not going to die. It'll be fine. Eve eats from this tree and then gets Adam to eat from the tree. And the repercussion, the consequence, the punishment, depending on how you want to think of it, is that they get booted from the garden and that we will have to farm in order to feed ourselves, right? And that is where the title of this class comes from. Cursed is the ground for your sake. In suffering you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles shall it bring forth to you. You shall eat the grass of the field, and by the sweat of your brow shall you eat bread, until you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and unto dust you shall return. So I think it's interesting, because I think in kind of the Jewish farming world, there's definitely a real sense of kind of optimism and nostalgia, or longing for this kind of like deep connection to the land through farming. And yet the image of farming that's first presented in our tradition is much more adversarial. First of all, you could read it as a punishment or a consequence for disobeying what was kind of the natural order in the garden. And it doesn't sound fun. It's going to be a struggle. We're going to have to work really hard in order to feed ourselves. And so what is this all about? Why would our tradition paint what is maybe not such a kind picture of agriculture? What does that mean for the ground to be cursed and for us to be struggling in this process? So I want to offer an interpretation of this story of the Garden of Eden and the exile and the subsequent chapters. And there's even kind of a theory that the entire book of Genesis is really describing this, so that what we're learning here are some archetypal stories of the agricultural revolution, of the transition of humans to going from hunters and gatherers to farmers, which we understand happened in roughly that part of the world, roughly the time that these stories take place. That this is kind of the stories that got passed down over generations of what that transition was like. So life in the garden is one of gathering, that there's abundant food growing and you just go and eat from it. And yet when we get exiled from the garden, that is when we actually start to farm. And there are a number of kind of hints at this in the text itself. So first of all, it says that what we will eat through this struggle, we will eat the grass of the field, meaning grains. And by the sweat of your brow, you shall eat bread. So bread is very much an agricultural product, right? You needed to have a more stationary, rooted life in order to grow grains and process those grains and then turn them into flour and bake them into bread. That was not something that hunters and gatherers consumed. And we know that some of the earliest domesticated plants were actually the perennial grains that got, wild perennial grains that got domesticated and became kind of the foundation of agriculture. There are some other kind of references in the story, and then as we kind of go through the lineages of the subsequent generations that point to this theory as well. And the texts that are included in this source sheet kind of go into a lot more detail. But the next story that we encounter is one of Cain and Abel, and that is a story of a farmer and a shepherd, brothers, a farmer and a shepherd who bring offerings to God, and the agricultural offering is rejected. And Cain, feeling jealous of his brother, kills him in the field. And we can read this as a story of individual sibling rivalry. We can also understand this again as pointing to what emerges as agriculture starts to take root, which is an ongoing tension that exists between farmers and shepherds. So farmers, as agriculture takes root and civilization starts to develop and permanent settlement starts to be established, farmers are very much focused on property. This is my field. I own this. I own the food that comes out of this land. Whereas shepherds are people who are always going to be reliant on the commons, who are going to be moving their animals around, grazing, and they can't possibly own all of that land. And we see this even till today. In the US, the government leases or allows access to publicly owned land for people who keep cattle and other animals. And so there's often this tension, and shepherds kind of often live on the margins of agricultural societies. and in a sense are almost kind of like be a little bit more of this bridge between farmers and hunter-gatherers. Shepherds are living somewhat more nomadic lives, migratory lives. They're moving their flocks, and so they're kind of on the edges of agricultural societies. And in fact, the earliest Jews in the Torah are primarily shepherds as well. It's not until quite later on that the Israelites really encounter agriculture as the primary form of sustenance. So if you look at the page 3 on that first source sheet, we come to the story of Joseph. Sorry about that. We come to the story of Joseph, and Joseph is, as you may know, sold into slavery by his siblings, and ends up making his way into Egypt and becomes the key advisor to the Pharaoh. And Joseph is good at interpreting dreams, and the Pharaoh has a series of dreams that Joseph interprets to mean that there will be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And so this story, I think, kind of points to one of the ways that agriculture can be seen in a certain way as a curse, or that the relationship is that the relationships that it creates, both in terms of our relationship to the planet and our relationship to each other, is maybe a lot more complicated. So Joseph advises the Pharaoh that in the 7 years of plenty, he should bring in the surpluses and store them, so that there will be enough to eat in the 7 years of famine. So on one hand, sage advice, definitely important in terms of sustaining a large nation empire at the time. But what it's done in a way where essentially the Pharaoh is in control of that surplus. So if we step back a little bit and we think about what are some of the implications of farming, what happens to humans when we start farming? So there's a number of different implications. The first thing this is why I asked how we might have how people might benefit from agriculture as kind of an introductory question, because one of the main ways that I benefit from agriculture is that I don't have to do it, is that I've already eaten like a meal and a snack, and I've had a couple of cups of tea, and I did almost nothing. In this case, I did literally nothing to create those foods, to bring those foods into being. I bought them at a store. And one of the main, whereas almost every other animal on the planet wakes up in the morning and says, what am I going to eat today? And goes out into nature and tries to find enough to eat. And certain animals will store surplus, but generally speaking, everyone's waking up and occupying themselves with finding what to eat. And that's what we did before we were farmers. Once we're farmers, we can assign that role to just a small percentage of the population. Right now in the US, it's hovering about 1% of the population are farm workers or farmers. So 99% of the population can do other things and still count on there being food, assuming the system works. So the division of labor is a huge implication. But one of the other things, other implications of agriculture essentially include the generation of wealth at a scale that was not possible pre-agriculture. Wealth kind of defined simply as having a surplus, having more than you need. Agriculture in a good year produces a surplus. So there's wealth that gets created. We can produce more than we might need in a given year. And then the question becomes, who controls that surplus? And whoever controls that surplus has a tremendous amount of power. So you start to see social and economic hierarchies emerge in agricultural societies. In my kind of limited understanding, anthropologists say that in hunter-gatherer societies, things were a lot more egalitarian, that pretty much everyone was occupied with securing food for themselves or their kind of family units. And these were societies that were much flatter. And in agriculture, we start to see major social and economic hierarchies emerge. And this story really points to that. So over the course of 7 years, the pharaoh accumulates a tremendous amount of surplus. And sure enough, the next round of 7 years comes, and there's famine in the land. And people come very quickly, because they don't have the surplus, they come very quickly to the pharaoh asking for food. And in the first year, they offer up all the money that they have. And Joseph takes the money into the pharaoh's palace. And in the second year, they say, we don't have any more money, and we've already given you our money, we've given you our land, we've given you our animals. Please just take us and let us work and have food to eat, and that we can work the land. So that essentially in just the second year of a 7-year famine, everyone in the entire region has essentially given the pharaoh all of their money, their property, their animals, and themselves. So very quickly, that power gets consolidated and concentrated in the pharaoh, and he has tremendous control over the entire region because of this situation. And in fact, so this is when the Israelites, who are at this point living in Canaan as shepherds, they come to Egypt as well, because there's famine, there's drought, they need food as well. And at first they're concerned. This is the great reunion between Joseph and his family. And when they come to settle in the land, they say, where are we going to live? We're shepherds. Everyone here who's presumably farmers is going to hate us. And Joseph says, don't worry, I have this great region for you, the region of Goshen. You're going to go and settle there, and that's great land for your flocks. And sure enough, that works out pretty well. But as we know, Joseph dies, his father Jacob dies, the pharaoh dies, and the Israelite nation starts to grow, and there's a new pharaoh who is skeptical of this nation and feels threatened by them, and eventually enslaves them. So this is really the firsthand experience that our ancestors have in relationship to agriculture is in the context of being enslaved in a highly oppressive and hierarchical society. And that's how they live for a long time. So we then have the dramatic story of the Exodus from Egypt and a period of wandering in the desert for 40 years before re-entering the land of Canaan. And when the Israelites are going to enter into the land of Canaan for the first time as a nation, they will become a nation of farmers. Most of the tribes will be occupied with agriculture. And once the temple is built, the whole system of sacrifices is very much kind of an output of agriculture. And one way of understanding, I think an important way of understanding kind of Judaism more broadly, but specifically kind of Judaism's approach to farming. And again, if we think about this as kind of aligned with the advent of agriculture and the development of agricultural societies that resisted agriculture, most of them got swallowed up. At this point, almost everyone on Earth is a part of an agricultural society. There's only a few kind of remote, non-farming societies remaining. And as agriculture was first establishing itself, because of the division of labor, because of the surplus, because of a rise in population, because of a dedicated military, agricultural societies were able to expand and conquer and take over more and more land. So one way of reading this is that our ancestors saw that agriculture was a force to be reckoned with, so to speak, that other nations that were resisting agriculture were disappearing. So they said, we'll become farmers. We're going to make this transition, but we're going to do so in a way that is different and that kind of preemptively addresses some of the injustices and inequities that emerge in other agricultural societies. And we see this, we can see the 40 years of in the desert as almost a cleansing of the palate when it comes to agriculture. In fact, the main food source as the Israelites are wandering the desert is manna that would just kind of magically appear on its own each day, that they would go out and collect it. They were only entitled to collect what they needed for that day, with the one exception being on Fridays, that they could collect a double portion for Shabbat. So essentially, for 40 years, we revert back to a pre-agricultural or an Edenic way of life, depending on how you want to think of it. But then we're going to enter into this land, and we're going to become farmers. And on the first page of the second source sheet, we have this passage from Deuteronomy, from Devarim, and it says, "For the land that you are about to enter and possess is not like the land of Egypt from which you have come. There, the grain you sowed had to be watered by your own labors, like a vegetable garden. But the land you are about to cross into and possess, a land of hills and valleys, soaks up its water from the rains of heaven." It then continues a few sentences later. "If then you obey the commandments," and this is from the second paragraph of the Shema, you might recognize some of this language. "If then you obey the commandments that I enjoin upon you this day, loving the divine Holy One and serving God with all your heart and soul, I will grant the rain for you, for your land in season, the early rain and the late rain. You shall gather in your new grain and wine and oil. I will also provide grass in the field for your cattle, and thus you shall eat your fill." So before we even enter this land and establish ourselves as an agricultural society, we're being told that it's going to be drastically different than what we experienced firsthand in Egypt, right? The oppression and exploitation and hierarchy that we saw back in Egypt, we're going to create a system that is drastically different. We're going to become farmers, but we're going to do so in ways that protect the needs of everyone in our society, and treat people and the land in a fair and sustainable way. So what exactly are these methods? What is this blueprint that we're going to engage in that's different than what we saw in Egypt? So first of all, just the notion that in Egypt there was the Nile, and the Nile would flood each year, and that enabled Egyptians to create these vast irrigation systems where food could essentially be grown all year round. It was, in a sense, kind of an ancient version of industrial agriculture. And because of the exploitation of workers, the labor was also cheap and productive. But we are entering a land, and if anyone has spent time in Israel, you know that there's a rainy season and a dry season, and that the success of the agriculture is going to be dependent on the rain coming in its proper time. And I love that in the text refers to these two types of rain, the Yoreh and the Malkosh, the early rains and the late rains, which I think points to a certain intimacy that Jews are supposed to have with rain, right? Rain is a huge topic in our tradition because we know the importance of it and in our collective success and viability. And it's said very clearly here that the rain is essentially a barometer of our collective moral well-being. If we follow these practices and follow these laws as they're being dictated to us, then the rain will come in its proper time. The systems will work, and we'll be able to eat our fill, and we'll be satisfied. And if we don't, then the land is essentially going to kick us out. It's not going to be viable for us to live there. So we're always kind of keeping ourselves in check. We're looking around and seeing how are we doing as a society, and that is going to be reflected in whether our agricultural systems are working in this land. So some of the things that we put into practice, so then we've included here a number of the Jewish agricultural laws. Things like peah, leaving the corners of the field unharvested, so that people who don't have their own fields can come and harvest for themselves. The gleanings and the forgotten harvests that are out in the field. A greedy farmer might want to go back out and collect everything. They've worked really hard to get everything, to grow everything, and they don't want to leave any of it behind. Our tradition teaches us that we should leave that, again, for the orphan, the widow, the landless, the poor, the stranger, the people who do not have access to their own fields, and the people who in other societies are the most marginalized, right? And we're putting their needs really at the center. And constantly throughout the Jewish agricultural, as the laws are being discussed or shared in the Torah, this contrast to Egypt is being emphasized, right? So in Dvarim and Deuteronomy, when it talks about the gleanings, it says, when you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you shall not go over it again. It shall be for the stranger, for the orphan, and for the widow. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I am commanding you to do these things. Egypt is constantly being brought up. The image of Egypt is constantly being brought up. And we are reminded that these laws are essentially in place because of our experience. We have to draw from that experience as having been slaves and having been strangers in the land of Egypt. Therefore, we know this feeling, and we need to design systems that address those experiences that we ourselves had. As we continue on with some of these laws, we have laws relating to how we treat animals, that we don't plow with an ox and a donkey harnessed together. Why? Because an ox would be much stronger than the donkey, and therefore the ox would be bearing more of the weight of the plow, and also would that would kind of drag the donkey along. So neither animal would be that wouldn't work out for either of the animals. We're also told not to muzzle an ox while it's threshing. So in the ancient granaries, when you harvest wheat berries, you have to thresh them. You have to crack the outer shell. And there's different ways of doing that, but one way would be to have an ox in a threshing room, essentially stepping on the grain. And the way that you motivate them to move around is there's all this food for them, but if you muzzle them so they can't eat it, it's essentially kind of torturing the animal. And so we're told that as we're going through this process of growing food and ideally growing a surplus, we can't be so greedy that we don't recognize the intrinsic value of the animal. We have to recognize that for this animal to be part of the system, we treat it with respect, we embrace the thing that it wants to do, and we let it access the food while it's doing that. Another practice of the Jewish agricultural blueprint, which I think is interesting, is that the priestly class, the Levites, the Leviim and Kohanim, the priests and the Levites, are the one class of people who are not allowed to own land. Whereas in many early agricultural societies, the priests, the religious, those with the religious power also had the social and economic power, as we saw in Egypt, where the Pharaoh actually ended up kind of owning the land, except for the land that was owned by the priests. This is maybe like a checks and balances system. We know that the Levi'im are going to have a certain amount of social and religious authority. So we want to limit the amount of economic power that they're allowed to have. And so they are not allowed to own land, and instead they also essentially get handouts from the community. And I think that is, again, a tool that can be used to keep some of the social and economic hierarchies from getting out of control. And then the final two agricultural laws that we include here are related to Shabbat and Shemitah. So we have Shabbat shows up a few times in the Torah. In this passage it says, "You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the feelings of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield, but in the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow. Let the needy among your people eat of it, and what they leave let the wild beasts eat of it. You shall do the same with your vineyards and olive groves. 6 days you shall do your work, but on the 7th day you shall rest, in order that your ox and your donkey may have rest, and that your bondsman and the stranger may be refreshed." So we have this kind of interesting sequence. At first, the reminder that we were slaves and that we were strangers in the lands of Egypt, and we need to kind of conjure up those feelings as we're thinking about how to design our society. For 6 years, we're going to farm. And in the 7th year, we're going to let the land rest and lie fallow, so that the needy among your people may eat of it, and what they leave, the wild beasts eat of it. We'll come back to that in a second. And then it continues on, you shall do the same with your vineyards and olive groves, and then 6 days you shall do your work, but on the 7th day you shall rest. So we have kind of concentric circles, right? We have the cycle, the weekly cycle of 6 days of work, followed by the 7th day of rest, where, and the reason given here is primarily so that your ox and your donkey may have rest, and that your bondsman, your slave, your indentured servant, and the stranger may be refreshed. It's not for you. It's for everyone other than you, essentially. The idea being that in many ancient societies, who got to take a day off? It would only be the elite, the noble, the wealthy, the powerful, whoever would get to take a day off of work. And what we're being told here is that everyone is required to rest, not just the humans, not just the Jews, but also the animals, and that is a key part of this kind of more just and equitable and sustainable system. Now, going back, we have the same kind of cycle playing out on an annual level. We have 6 years of work where we engage in farming and we bring in the harvests. And in the 7th year, we let the land rest and lie fallow so that the needy amongst our people can eat, right? Now, there's a whole other class I could teach about Shemitah. We're not going to have time to go so far deep into Shemitah itself. But I think it's important to note that the first time Shemitah is referenced in the Torah, the reason given for it is essentially an economic one to benefit the poor. It's to give the poor access to food, which is like a puzzling thing, because you'd think if the goal of a sabbatical year is to feed the poor, you would say, well, keep farming and just give it all away. But we're actually told to not farm. And I think the main idea to take from this is the idea that essentially in the Shemitah year, we revert to an Edenic way of life. In the sabbatical year, in the Shemitah year, all land becomes commons. All food that grows on its own is fair game. But it's ownerless. So if you had an orchard of fruit trees and they're producing fruit in the Shemitah year, anyone can come and harvest from that fruit. And you're allowed to go out and pick it as well, but you can't store it. You can't take more than you need. So we essentially revert to the way of life where we meet our immediate needs on a day-to-day basis without trying to stockpile surpluses or accumulate wealth. There's another aspect of the Shemitah year, which is that at the end of every Shemitah year, any debt that's being held from one person to another gets erased. And in fact, the word Shemitah means release. It's a release of the debt. And a way to understand this is that first of all, that it happens at the end of the Shemitah year. Why would it happen at the end of the Shemitah year? Because in an agricultural community, and we see this even till today, borrowing money is often an essential part of being a farmer. You have a lot of expenses at the beginning of the year. You have your seeds, your tools, your fertilizers, etc. And you're not going to actually get paid until you start selling the produce, which can be several months later. So, right, the whole idea of a CSA, a community-supported agriculture program, was developed to give farmers the money at the beginning of the season when they actually need it, and not to have to wait until the end of the season where they're selling their harvest. So there's a certain amount of debt that happens in an agricultural society that's healthy. You borrow money at the beginning of the year, you invest in your farm, in your land, in your tools, in your seeds, and then at the end of the year you sell it and you have more than you have to pay back and you've made some money. So that kind of debt is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about debt that still exists at the end of the Shemitah year. So at the end of a year where you have refrained from engaging in agriculture, where you haven't had to borrow money to invest in the process only to then make that money back, any lingering debt gets erased. Essentially what it's saying is that that we don't want disparities of wealth, disparities of income, cycles of poverty to continue beyond a certain amount. And that the Shemitah year gives basically a pressure release button for the society, where people who are experiencing a lot of hardship have a way out. Because the goal of this blueprint, the overarching goal, is not for some people to make a lot of money and other people to be struggling. It's to be able to keep going as a society indefinitely. And we know that when there's huge disparities of wealth that emerge in societies, as we're starting to see here in the United States right now, a growing disparity of wealth, that's not a good recipe for sustainability for a society. And so part of our agricultural blueprint, which is really an economic blueprint, is saying that we need to essentially redistribute those resources. Every 7 years, if there's someone who's not able to pay back their debt, they are freed from that debt. And then the next ring of the concentric circles is the Yovel, the Jubilee year, which after 49 years, after 7 cycles of 7 years, in the 50th year, all land gets returned to its ancestral origin. All land gets returned to the lineage of the family who first settled that land when the Israelites came into Canaan. And so that is a way of preventing intergenerational debt from kind of cascading from one generation to the next. So these Jewish agricultural laws, if you look at the last page of the second source sheet, over the years, through kind of teaching these materials and having really exciting discussions about them and seeing how they might manifest in today's society, what we kind of came up with were these 7 core Jewish agricultural values. And so we say that the Jewish agricultural traditions compel us to create a food system that centers the needs of the most vulnerable, encourages gratitude and generosity, values physical labor, treats workers and animals fairly, and integrates cycles of sacred rest for all, facilitates emotional and spiritual connection to food, plants, nature, and the wilderness, celebrates through feasting and fasting, redistributes land and wealth, and puts limits on power. So some of those are values that you could see how they emerge from what we've been talking about today. Other ones kind of emerge from some of the other agricultural laws or some of the other labor laws or some of the other practices around holidays, etc. But you can see that there's this kind of core to what is Jewish farming. I would say, first and foremost, it's a recognition that farming is one way of living on this planet. It's not the only way. It has some inherent challenges. And so we need to design our systems around it in ways that address those challenges, in particular, centering the needs of the most vulnerable. And I think that that the different Jewish agricultural laws really help build the scaffolding for that. So that kind of walks you through the texts that are included in these two source sheets. I guess maybe what I want to do is share a little bit about how I might use these and point you to two other tools that are available to you related to this. But maybe before that, we'll just take a few questions about the content of what we've covered today, and then I'll kind of close with pointing you in the direction of some of those other resources. So I guess you can either put a question in the chat box, or you can kind of unmute yourself, and if we're not too unruly, and ask a question.
Nati, Alex asks, and I know because having taught this material, this question comes up a lot. It just came up like 3 weeks ago, which is, he says, I can't wrap my head around Shemitah in any practical way. And he caveats that charging interest, yeah, that makes sense. Like that is something that have real impact. But the concept that anyone at any point ever did roll out Shemitah, that is it possible? It's just an ideal, and it's totally an impossibility. That comes up a lot.
Yeah. So my understanding, I mean, it's a great question, and I think my understanding around it is a fewfold. One is that it's not surprising that it would be hard for us to wrap our heads around Shemitah, because we haven't kept Shemitah in 2,000 years, and even the way it's practiced in Israel today, where it still applies. Primarily, if you were to go to Israel during a Shemitah year and go to the market, you might see like more signs than normal explaining where the food's coming from. But like as a consumer, you can pretty much live in a very similar way as you do in other years, because we've figured out ways to kind of stay within some of the letter of the law while essentially still being part of like a global economy and global agricultural system. So I guess be gentle on yourself that you might not be able to wrap your head around it, because it's a pretty radical concept, and we don't really know what it looks like, and certainly not in a modern context. And secondly, I think understanding it as a way of engaging in agriculture, but kind of honoring a non-agricultural lineage, is that it was like an effort to do that. And also, one of the main things to understand about Shemitah is that you're not going to be able to practice it if you live 6 years in kind of a normal way and then just try to keep Shemitah in the 7th year. It's really about designing an entire system around Shemitah. You're going to need to plant a lot more perennials, and perennials take many years to grow, and you have the practice of not eating from them for the first 3 years. So if you want to have robust perennials and fruit in the Shemitah year, you got to plant that stuff in the 1st and 2nd year of the cycle. So you need to be thinking about it all the time. But I think that my understanding is that it was practiced. It was practiced. It was also like violated. And that there at least is some real evidence that it was practiced. Whereas my understanding about Yovel, the Jubilee year, is that we don't necessarily know if it was ever practiced. And if there's anyone on the call who has more information about that.
May I say something, please?
Yeah, I just want to give the floor to my father. I'm really excited to have him here on the webinar.
I've lived in Israel for the last 17 years. I've been through 2 Shemitah cycles. And what we found is that more and more people are actually observing Shemitah fully. In other words, suddenly you drive along on the highways and you see big signs saying, we observe Shemitah completely. In other words, we're not farming at all this year. And so it's growing. The other aspect of Shemitah also has to do with forgiving of debts, Shemitah Ksafim, which is an easier thing to do, and there are many people who do it. There are ways, again, there are ways around it, what's called the Prusbo, but there's no reason why you have to do that. You certainly can. If somebody owes you money, especially a poor person, there's no reason why you have to collect the debt. You can say the debt is now forgiven if you're able to afford it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and from what I understand, this past Shemitah year in Israel, the government actually allocated funds for farmers who wanted to keep Shemitah fully, and gave them some basic income. And I also heard of a program that the government was running where, kind of in the vein of the forgiving of debts, where families that had a lot of personal debt could get some of that debt erased if they took like personal finance classes. And so it was kind of a modern application of this value that was being supported by the government, as far as I know.
I was living in Israel at that time, and it definitely was. It was like the lowest percentile, like the highest risk percentile of economic situation, and then it was debt forgiveness. It was really amazing. The other thing about Yovel that I could add is that the nascent Sanhedrin, whether anyone agrees that they're the Sanhedrin or not, but the body that is called the nascent Sanhedrin, they declared the Yovel again, which they started off for the count, which would mean that as the years go by and it gets closer to that date, there's going to be discussions about it, which is fascinating. I mean, from that point. One of the things also, Nati, and I know this is raised a lot of times when this material is introduced, Rachel asked about the difference between diaspora and Israel. So I know that a lot of times when we talk about farming, it gets farming in Israel and Jewish farming outside of Israel relevant at all. If there's, how come we keep Shabbat here, but we don't do the agricultural, those type of questions. And I'm sure that you've had a lot of interesting conversations about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, there are a couple of the agricultural laws that do apply outside of Israel. I believe Orla, the practice of not harvesting fruit from a fruit tree for the first 3 years, that applies everywhere. I'm pretty sure Kilaim, not mixing species in a field, and it's not, people hear that and often think like you're not allowed to companion plant your basils and tomato, and it's not quite like that. It's a little more complex than that, but that applies everywhere as well. It's a good question. I learned with a Jewish permaculturist here in Pennsylvania. He lives in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, named Benjamin Weiss, and as he's first and foremost a farmer and a permaculture practitioner, and only recently has kind of gotten a little more turned on to Judaism. And as he was learning some of this stuff, what he shared, which I thought was insightful, was that any indigenous culture in the world, meaning any culture that has a long established relationship with land, a particular place, and has developed its culture and society around, in part around that relationship, has its own land management practices that emerge out of a specific place to a specific piece of land. And that maybe Shemitah is kind of part of that legacy for the Israelites, for our ancestors, meaning it's a practice that doesn't necessarily work in other climates, but maybe the climate of Israel is one that's more conducive to Shemitah actually making sense. And maybe in some ways, some of these other practices are similar. Peah and Leket, leaving the corners of the field and leaving the gleanings, that those somehow fit within the larger framework that and the larger society that develops in that region, and it's not, and therefore they might not translate all everywhere. Something like orla, not harvesting the fruit from the fruit tree. Many people say that's just really good practice, right? That in the first few years of planting a fruit tree, you want it to focus its energy on establishing deep roots. And there's farmers that will actually pluck the buds as they're first starting to grow so that the plant puts more energy into its root system. I think that is really points even more to, I mean, I think one of the underlying themes here for me is one of humility, right? That as farmers, we need to be humble and not think that just because we do the work of growing the food, that it's ours. We're instructed both to share it with other people and other animals, and also to make blessings, to essentially like ask for permission and ask and offer gratitude before we consume it. And that those are really important checks on, I think, what can be kind of a certain amount of arrogance that can emerge from an agricultural mindset, where agriculture is very much about manipulating the land to meet your own needs. And so to kind of keep that in check a little bit, I think is really important. And in fact, going back to this idea that the story of the Garden of Eden is kind of a story of the agricultural revolution, one understanding is what's the tree that is forbidden? The tree that is forbidden is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And one way of understanding that is that that's like the knowledge of to choose what to nurture and what to destroy. And essentially that's what farming is. You're choosing, you're saying, I want these plants to thrive in this particular place, and I don't want other plants. I don't care if this plant grows out in the forest. I just don't want it in my field. So I'm going to destroy it, and I'm going to nurture these other plants. And that maybe that playing that role of what lives and what dies is essentially what that means to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Also, it's interesting to note, I don't know how the apple got kind of picked as the fruit. It most likely was not an apple. But in the Gemara, in the Talmud, there's a discussion about what the fruit is. And there's even an opinion that that it was wheat. And that, again, wheat being kind of like the early icon of agriculture, and pointed to in the text itself, where it says, when we are kicked out, we will eat the grass of the field and we will eat bread, which is something that we wouldn't have eaten in the garden. We are just about out of time, and I wanted to make sure to point you in a couple of other directions. So I'm going to put in the chat 2 more links. And I'm also going to share my screen in just a moment. We created a slideshow that kind of accompanies these texts that has, I think, 10 images, illustrations, and a selection of some of the texts. And I'm curious to see how educators might want to use that. And it might make it something that maybe younger audiences could look at and learn from it. Kind of the texts are a bit consolidated, and the illustrations kind of bring some of it to life. So there's a link to that. And there's, we also have kind of a really beautiful version of the 7 core Jewish agricultural values as a poster. And that's available for you all to use, either to print out on a larger scale or a smaller scale, or certainly use with participants. Yeah, and I guess, like I mentioned, I would often teach this class as 2 or 3 hour to hour and a half sessions with the same group, to kind of give ample time to really dive into these texts and address questions that come up. What I also found is a really good then next step is, once you've kind of built this foundation of this is what Jewish agricultural values are. This is what the kind of the core morality of the Jewish agricultural blueprint is. Now we're at a point where we can then talk about kind of contemporary food justice issues in our own communities and approach that as Jews and bring kind of some of the wisdom of our tradition to that conversation. And so we often would teach these two text studies, and then maybe a third or a fourth part would be a dive into contemporary food justice issues. And there's a lot of resources. There's some stuff in the seed packet related to food justice. There's also links to some other websites that have tremendous resources on food justice. But I found that kind of once you have that foundation, it makes for a contemporary discussion about food justice much more interesting and meaningful, as, you know, in the context of Jewish farm-based education. And then I put it in the sidebar as well, but I just want to mention for folks who are really interested in Shemitah and diving into that on a much deeper level, Chazon's Shemitah source book is really phenomenal, and it includes kind of like all the foundational texts and a lot of kind of creative thinking about how to bring those texts into the 21st century. And that's available on the Chazon website. And I imagine that they are also, Chazon has been kind of one of the leaders in the field focusing on Shemitah. And as we're getting closer to the next Shemitah year, I know they're working on some stuff, and maybe they'll issue an updated version of that or some additional resources. But that's a great place to go, and it's very comprehensive. And I guess that's pretty much it. I want to thank Zachia and thank everyone for taking the time today. We're going to post a link to the webinar has been recorded. We're going to post a link to that probably in the Facebook group, and I don't know where else, or in the Facebook event. But please let me know. I'm really curious to stay in touch with folks and hear how you might use these materials, in particular the slideshow, which is new. And I'm curious to see how kind of educators use and adapt and pass on some of these ideas to their students. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Nati, so much, and thank you everyone for being here. We, like Nati said, we will be posting it in the Facebook group, and then the video is live and available for everybody. The live video will be recorded and it will be available for everybody.
Great.
Thank you.
All right.